Knowing which troop to main in Call of Dragons can be a little bit confusing when you're first starting out the game. So, in today's video, we'll be discussing Cavalry. We'll be going through their tips, their tricks, their pros and cons, their commander pairings, and most importantly, should you main Cavalry in Call of Dragons? Stick around in this video to find out the answer to that question. What is going on, guys? MEOWER here, back with a brand new Call of Dragons video. Before we get this video started, I would first of all like to give a special thanks to each and every one of you because we finally crossed the 1000 subscriber threshold. So, thank you very, very much for your continued support to the channel and helping me out personally with encouraging me to make even more videos, and it has been a glorious ride so far. However, it is still getting started, so stick around with the channel because we're gonna go to even greater heights over time. Now, with that out of the way, let's get this video started. So, we're going to be discussing cavalry, their pros and cons, the best methods to use them, and whether if it's in the open field, in rallying, and raiding, and some special tips and important information for you to know about cavalry in order to maximize their potential and knowing their proper commander pairings. Let's get started. It is no secret that cavalry is always the flashy troop that so many people wish to main or use in general because they're fast, they do a lot of damage, and generally they're quite fun to use. Which I do highly agree. They are some of the most fun troops to pilot, and their potential is super high to dish out a lot of damage and might even change the tide of a lot of fights. However, some keynotes to keep in mind when it comes to cavalry, which I will be breaking down for you right now, starting with the pros and cons. Okay, the pros of cavalry, they do a lot of damage, they're super fast, and they are super reliable when it comes to either raiding farmers, cutting off reinforcements, or even carrying some certain behemoth raids. Their cons, however, is that they are really hard to execute properly because you it really depends on how well you can position yourself or how well you can uh, cut off the enemy correctly without drawing too much attention because cavalry marches tend to melt super quickly. As their base stats, while good, their commanders don't really offer that much survivability, making them melt pretty quickly if they are targeted by a lot of enemies. Another con for them, or rather a certain troop type of them, which is the Elk Spring Warden faction Elk Rider, is treated as a range march and not as a cavalry march. I will explain that a little more in the video. However, they are really reliant on the hit and run tactic, whether no matter what type of cavalry you are using. That is it for the pros and cons. Let's see what other cavalry types there are and explain the whole thing about being treated as a range march for the Spring Warden faction. Melee units in Call of Dragon tend to have their counterattack damage halved. So for example, you'll notice that Knights can launch a counterattack when attacked by range units, but they deal half their counterattack damage. The same rule applies for infantry. It is the same thing, they deal half the counterattack damage. However, when it comes to certain types of cavalry or certain types of unit, because every single faction has their own unit types and attributes, you notice that the Spring Wardens here have ranged cavalry, so they deal their full counterattack damage, whether if they're hit by melee or hit by ranged. So do keep that in mind. However, while that might seem like a buff, it is actually a nerf because the Spring Warden Elf Riders lose access to the charge skill, which charge skill here, as it states, the unyielding rush march speed increases when approaching a target legion after colliding with a range march, but you should be using your um, cavalry march on while hunting range marches such as archers or mages, cutting them off and such, you'll gain a full rage cast skill. This effect can only be triggered to every 12 seconds, so that means the moment you touch a range march, you pull off your rage skill immediately. The elven elk riders do not have that luxury, however, but the elven forest eagles do. So keep that in mind when you are running the Warden faction. The League of Order have standard knights, and so does the Wolf Riders of the um, Wilderberg faction. However, when you are choosing which faction to run when it comes to wanting to main cavalry, it will be between the Wilderberg faction and the Springwarden faction to have access to ranged and melee, and to have access to purely melee with a higher physical attack stat buff of 30%. When it comes to the cavalry pairings, however, your options tend to be very limited between Emrys, Bakshi, and Alistar, and some might be argued for Hosk as well. However, Hosk is not a purely cavalry commander, so it will boil down between those three: Emrys Bakshi and Alistar. Alistar is completely worthless, so we're going to be discussing mainly Emrys and Bakshi, as they're both super accessible for free to play and pay to win alike, as they're both gold key commanders and they function perfectly at 5-1-1-1. As for their pairings, if you want to go raiding and hunting down enemy gatherers, I would recommend running Emrys primary and Bakshi secondary. The reason for that is to access the mobility tree and the cavalry tree to emphasize more on your march speed and your upfront burst of regular attack damage to make use of hitting all the gatherers, because gatherers tend to be melee units, so you won't be able to utilize the rage skill as much, and rather dumping as much damage up front as possible and maneuvering around the field to avoid getting hit or caught, and while also running either the storm arrows um, artifact in order to jump cliffs. You can also run the cloak of stealth to be stealthy and run around the map, sneak behind the enemies and then appear in the middle of their fields, and then just butcher everything and try to run away as fast as possible. And of course, there is the Kingslayer, which is one of the best artifacts in the game right now. However, that will change uh, with the next update, and I will explain that in a future video when the update comes out. As for regular PvP, Bakshi primary, Emrys secondary, because you want to be running your cavalry march to hit as many range marches as possible. So you want to make use of the skill tree as primary and the cavalry tree as secondary to make use of as much skill damage as possible in order to nuke as many uh, range marches as you possibly can. However, when it comes to awakening either of them, I would definitely recommend awakening Emrys before Bakshi, as Emrys' skills all provide a lot more value than Bakshi, while Bakshi can function perfectly at 5-1-1-1. That is it for Cavalry, knowing how to use them, knowing everything there is to know about them. If you have any questions, please let me know in the comments down below or join our Discord. I would love to see you there, have a conversation, request videos, and all that good stuff. On a side note, I just recently bought a new microphone, so let me know if it's good, if it's bad, if it needs adjusting. I really would appreciate your feedback. Thank you for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and I will see you in the next video. Meow meow.